Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session. I'm Carolyn. I'm the organizer of this session together with Matthew Chu. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, so I just want to explain briefly why we're doing this session. So it's an attempt to counteract global academic stratification or academic dependency. So the problem is globally, like theory building, concept formation, setting of research agendas, of methodological standards, etc. is usually undertaken in the global north and especially in the US. Sociology, so for a lot of global southern country, there's pressure to get published in good journals or good conferences, and these are usually the global northern ones. So there's a pressure to comply with northern theoretical, methodological, conceptual, etc. standards, even if you have data from the global south that does not even fit these standards. And at the same time, it is very hard for scholars in the global south to access and be heard in the venues that actually set these standards, such as ASA or such as the highest ranked journals. So basically, people in the global south are receiving the pressure to comply to these standards while having very little influence over negotiating them from a southern perspective. So the session here is an attempt to do so. And our presenters will show how specific theories, methods, or assumptions that have a northern positionality or bias can be reimagined from a southern perspective to attain a more complete understanding of them. So presenters will show how analyses of race, class, and gender benefit from a global perspective that takes into account global capitalism and coloniality. And they will ask what effects colonialism and the Eurocentric colonial gaze actually have on various forms of inequality experienced by colonialized or previously colonialized populations. And in order to introduce the speakers, so Professor Bandana Purkayastha is Professor of Sociology and Asian and American Studies at the University of Connecticut, and she has published extensively and internationally on human rights, intersectionality, transnationalism, migrants, violence, and peace, and has received a huge number of awards, especially the recent ASA Jesse Bernard Award. And Phoebe Sanchez is a professor of sociology and history at the University of the Philippines, Cebu, and she's currently a research fellow at the Université Catholique de Louvain-Neuve. She's also a scholar activist and using Marxist and feminist perspectives, among others. She has published extensively on various forms of social and political inequality and problems in the Philippines. Kyra Cañete is a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales, and her research examines the Build Back Better reconstruction of Tacloban city in the Philippines from a feminist standpoint. And she has also published 6 academic articles and 3 book chapters on related issues. And Rosa Ocona Acevedo is a Puerto Rican PhD student in the philosophy department at the University of Oregon. And she studies the intersections of race, gender, and coloniality in the experiences of oppression and resistance in Caribbean subjects, and has published a number of scholarly works on these issues. And then last but not least, Sujata Patel is a distinguished professor at Savitribai Phule Pune University. I'm very sorry about my horrible pronunciation. Her work on modernity and social theory, history of sociology and social sciences, urbanization and city formation, social movements, gender construction, and caste and class formation in India combines a historical sensibility with 4 perspectives: Marxism, feminism, spatial studies, and post-structuralism. And she has authored, edited, and co-edited 13 books and 63 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters. And she has been active in organizational roles at the ISA and was also president of the Indian sociological society. Okay, and please, Bandana Purkayasta, we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Give me a moment because I want to share my screen. Okay, is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first and foremost, I want to thank Carolyn for persuading me to present on this panel. I was really looking forward to listening to the other speakers, especially Phoebe and Sujata, who I have known for some time. But nonetheless, in the spirit of contributing, I decided I have something to say and I will share it, and you can definitely bring me into a conversation. Now, even though my paper is called Understanding Northern Problems via Southern Theories, there are some caveats that I wish to put in. First, the paper is not really about the global North or the global South. I'll use some illustrative examples, and I'll primarily draw on the US, where I'm positioned, to show you some of the problems with the global North theories regarding migrants and migrations, which will really form the focus of whatever I discuss as problems. Now, the issues that have kind of really haunted me, if you will, as I keep looking at migration is not only the rapidly growing number of migrants, according to US statistics, and of course, there are all kinds of discussions we can have about these statistics, but nonetheless, by the end of 2019, 272 million people in the world are regarded as migrants. But more importantly to this discussion are, if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, those 79.5 million people who've been forcibly displaced. And even without looking at the numbers, if you can just look at the trend lines, you can see how rapidly these numbers are growing. And the second number that's relevant there, and I know you perhaps may not be able to see it very well, are the 45.7 million people who are internal migrants. That is, these are people who are actually displaced from wherever they live within the political boundaries of the countries they live. So these people, of course, include, as I said, people who experience forced displacement. That includes refugees and asylum seekers and stateless citizens. And what these data don't show you are the persons who are trafficked for sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, and for their organs. So this is one constituency of migrants that I have been trying to understand through the kind of frameworks that I learned in the US and certainly by reading literatures far beyond the US. Now, the second thing that has engaged my attention and actually my fears is this rapid development of a global security industry. So to put it into perspective, just for all of the people who are located in the US, as of 2015, I'm not even talking about 2020, where the numbers have gone up, but according to Migration Policy Institute, by 2015, 62% of migrants who were actually in detention centers were in beds provided by for-profit detention centers. For-profit detention centers have increased so rapidly that between 2007 and 2014, Core Civics, which is one such organization, saw its profits, not spending, profits, go from $133 million to $195 million. And the Geo Group, which actually runs some of the detention centers with local participants in Australia and other places, their profits just for the US went from $42 million to $144 million. So clearly there's an industry that profits off human beings, and migrants, especially if you can shrink the universe of their rights, are really the currency through which profits are made. So I want you to keep that in mind. The third issue that I want you to keep in mind is the inadequate attention we pay to internal migrants. Now, because of COVID in some countries of the world, we have heard about migrants within countries, but usually these are not people we talk about. Even though, turning back to the US, we do know about internal migrations. We have read, or many of us have read, Isabel Wilkerson's previous book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which talks about the formerly enslaved African Americans who, caught in situations of indenture, tried to move to other parts of the US. Or we know about the indigenous groups that were forcibly, displaced from their homeland and they had to, migrate elsewhere. Or people who were forced to leave and migrate elsewhere after disasters such as the Katrina disaster, or in Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, and on and on and on. But somehow these do not make into our migration discussions. Now, part of the reason for this, and now I'm just going to talk about the global north for a little while, and particularly about the US, is just because the strands of conversation are so fragmented. The focus is on this category called international migrants, with marginal conversations, really marginal conversations on internal migrants. If we again, I mean global north scholars, are studying refugees at all, we are studying them out there, that is in other countries. If there are refugees within the US, they're being thrown into that international migrant category, and the conversations and studies about them begin to become very different from the refugee studies carried on elsewhere. Same with trafficking studies, they're completely separate from the migration studies. Part of this is really because of methodological nationalisms and also the ways in which US sociology have developed. Now, with Sujata on the panel, I'm not going to talk about methodological nationalisms because she is one of the world's experts on it. But what I wish to say is the reason why the dominant conversations, and I want to emphasize dominant conversations on migration, continue to focus on assimilation and integration is because it's serving the interests of the state and the dominant groups whose interests are served by that state. It's not as though the US does not have scholarship that focuses on all these other categories of worries, if you will, that I shared with you, but they tend to be marginalized, or they tend never to become quite central to the conversations about migrations and migrants. Now, the other thing that I want to remind you about Northern theories, and I'll come back to this at the very end, is of course, the dominant voices are best positioned within a very powerful knowledge production and dissemination industry. And this dissemination industry doesn't simply work through the academic channels of disseminating knowledge. It works through a whole series of other actors and sets of actors that I've written about elsewhere, and I'll be happy to go into it later on. But for example, human rights organizations, how do they get their knowledge? What are they acting on? All of these kind of become related through a transnational assemblage of knowledge. Now, I would argue, as I've done before, that one of the ways in which we can move towards seriously learning from and enriching the ways in which we study migrations by looking at Southern theories or scholars who are positioned in the global South who are talking about migration and migrants is by letting go of our fragmented classifications such as international migrants and then internal migrants, then refugees, then trafficked persons and so on. Because after all, if you just look at these categories, and in a way I created these categories as a way of also indicating that each of these categories really also kind of alert you to the degree of direct force and violence in people in these categories face. But nonetheless, what happens is that you could have refugees who are trafficked. Amongst the international migrants are people who are trafficked for labor, and governments are increasingly in the business of creating all of these different kinds of guest worker categories, which are very close to indentured labor that global South scholars have written about for a long time, and then keep and not admitting to their being trafficked, somewhat under false pretenses at times. Um, Furthermore, the whole issue of refugees and internal displaced persons, where are they housed, where do they stay, who looks after them, is tied to a large humanitarian, really transnational corporations, as Ronald Bishamuddin has called them. And so there are other ways to look at these categories of people, understanding that there are shifts and changes even within any set of migrants' lifetimes. So what are some of the strands of conversation that at least I have found very, very useful? This is not to say that you have to follow everything that I have found useful, but I just want you to get a sense, especially people who are hearing this from the US, of the kinds of conversations that have already happened for decades. So I will start with Ranbir Shamadar and the Kolkata Research Group, who've been studying all kinds of migrants for multiple decades. And one of the things that they always insist upon is to question the state. Instead of taking the state as normalized and its powers and violence as normalized operations of life, to always begin these questions of migration, whether they are short distance, short-term migrations, or migrations across nation-state boundaries, to query what are various levels of the states getting out of channeling and fooling particular groups of people to only be able to settle in some places, only have certain rights, and so on and so forth. They've talked a great deal about labor migration, and honestly, if you look at their work, they've talked about labor migration under colonial conditions, and it's the same argument that they are making right now about the movement of what in the West we would call either trafficked persons or movements of indentured laborers. All of the guest workers, whether they are highly skilled or whether they're coming in to perform the kind of work that no country can find it amongst its own labor forces, they would say is just part of this whole kind of capitalist profit-making pursuit that is organized in ways where it looks like people are coming voluntarily, but in fact serves the needs of profit-making organizations. Also, along those lines, what is interesting, and I'm going to connect it to their work on stateless citizens, is a kind of work that has come out of South Africa post-apartheid, where there are scholars, and I've named a few like Ghulam Wahid or Narisa Ramnani and others, who are really asking the questions that at what point can states, with shifts and changes in power, how can states change the categories of its citizens for multiple generations and begin to call them foreigners? What happens? And whose interest does it serve? That major question. And of course, Kolkata Research Group has done a lot of work on the making of stateless citizens. Their work on the Rohingyas were initially produced at least a good almost a decade before the Rohingyas became news in the global north. But I would say that even looking at these two categories of scholarships that I talked about would go a great deal towards our understanding of who is being put into cages in the US, in those detention centers that I talked about, so that some people make profit right now. If you don't understand these larger conditions, then these look like episodic events, whereas they are not. They serve particular political and economic purposes. I would also, just point out the work that's on humanitarianism as a form of colonialism. Sari Hanafi in Lebanon has written a great deal on Palestinian refugees and their settlement in various refugee settlements in different countries. Or Roseanne Injiru writing on Kenya and the internally displaced persons. Or Ronbe Shomadar himself, actually Alberto Donini here in the US as well, writing about humanitarianism and the whole operation as a way of holding people at a distance so that the powers and the structures and the operations of the West can freely operate in other countries. And I'm not going to go back to my slide, but in the previous slide, I had as a list some of the countries that hold the largest number of refugees in the world. And they're certainly not in the global north. They're held distance in places where the global north can't see them on a day-to-day basis. But definitely there are lots of people whose occupations and careers are geared towards what is termed as a humanitarian initiative, but often does not serve the needs of the migrants who are held in those places. Sally Yee, who is located in Australia, but with colleagues in Singapore and parts of East and Southeast Asia, have done stellar work on labor trafficking, tracing out country by country how countries take away rights from migrants and how they basically put them in indentured labor situations. So I won't go on and on about this. I'm trying to keep some eye on the time. But this is a big point that I wish to make. That if you look at the world of migration today, there is both a kind of uniqueness in terms of where refugees are housed, where people are detained, whose power is leading to these rapidly growing profit-making initiatives that depend on humans being put into these detention/prison-like conditions. There are, of course, it's mostly transnational corporations housed in the global north that are doing it, but nonetheless, similar kinds of efforts are emerging in the global south as well. So the issue is, as Carolyn mentioned right at the beginning, and I fully agree with, so the issue is, on the one hand, there's the push through institutions and academias to publish in global journals. On the other hand, there are realities on the ground that could be better addressed with theories and frameworks and studies that have been done in many countries in the global south that could not only be of use to those countries, they could be of use to other countries in the global south and certainly countries in the global north. But I'm saying this also while I want to emphasize that it's not simply a case of global north scholars going and reading frameworks and research in other countries and then somehow co-opting them. That happens too often. It's unethical. We would say it's unethical, but we all know it happens, and ideas are taken and just associated with other big names. So I do want to put in a kind of concern about just not talking about global south theories in a symbolic kind of way. That serves nobody's purpose if people are trying to do ethical research. The second point that I want to highlight is actually, I think because global north and global south are kind of large entities, if you will, we have to be mindful of internal hierarchies in each of those spaces. And it is possible to create synergies amongst the so-called marginalized in any of these places. But any kind of synergies, any kind of collaboration has to be done with a clear understanding of hegemonies. And it has to be done with an understanding really of the context and the temporality and the objective that we have in mind when we are trying to do these studies. So with that, I will thank you and I will end the slideshow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we'll turn over to Phoebe Sanchez.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Yeah, I'm looking for my PowerPoint. I'm going to. Can you see my, okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, the colonial appropriation of women's indigenous knowledge, the case of the Sugbuana. The Sugbuana are the native women of the island of Cebu in the Visayan region, Philippines. The island is originally known as Zubu, also known as Islas de Pintados y Pintadas, or the Islands of the Painted Ones. The Sugbuana in ancient Visayan society have autonomy over their bodies and their sexuality, autonomy in terms of consciousness, autonomy in their material world by virtue of their craftsmanship and productivity. Antonio Pigafetta, the chronicler from Spain, published in 1524 in pages 166 to 167, and I quote, "Those people go naked wearing but one piece of palm tree cloth about their privies. The males, large and small, have their penis pierced from one side to the other near the head with a gold or tin bolt as large as a goose quill. In both ends of the same bolt, some have resembles a spur with points upon the end, others like the head of a cart nail. I very often asked many, both old and young, because I could not credit it. In the middle of the bolt is a hole through which they urinate. The bolt and spur always hold firm. They say that their women wish it so, and that if they did otherwise, they would not have communication with them. When the men wish to have communication with their women, the latter themselves take the penis not in the regular way and commence very gently to introduce it into their vagina with a spur on top first and then the other part. When it is inside, it takes its regular position, and thus the penis always stays inside until it gets soft, or otherwise they could not pull it out." During this early period, the Cebuano society was equipped with its own set of written characters or alphabets, while women enjoyed autonomy over their body and occupied a decisive status in society. These were reflected in their active participation in all aspects of the social, cultural, and economic domains. In marriage, they enjoyed the freedom to control and own properties and engage in trade. The women Cebuana were believed to be the first technologists of production in earlier times that was proven through their contribution in the material world. These technologies were ascribed in their roles in agricultural production and in their expertise in weaving and pottery production. Likewise, they managed the home and the affairs of the community and performed rituals from planting to harvest seasons, from sending off slave raiders to their victories, from birth to marriage, and from sickness to healing or to death. In other words, the Sugboana were decisive factors in the community's continuum of life. The women in the early Sugboanan society served as the institution for the preaching and the teaching domain via epic singing, lullabies, community prayers, and ritual performances. Education during this period was deeply associated with the cosmic orientation of the domestic and collective activities. It was grounded on everyday experiences and activities associated with the daily tasks of the men and women relative to the indigenous resources and technologies in the community. If tattoos of the native men depicted their bravery, to the women, these symbolized the magnitude and power of words and letters they carried on their arms. Their tales, their lullabies, their songs, their prayers, their myths, epics, and sacred hymns were their means of molding young minds and nurturing the early community's memories and value systems. With the Spanish conquistadors and the early missionaries, the women's roles were automatically regarded as works of the demon implanted in their minds. The colonizers, through the church, transformed their consciousness and their status. For instance, Queen Juana had her role and position highlighted to bring to the fore the Spanish ordained role of King Humabon as chief on top of other chiefdoms in the islands. But the concept of hierarchy of chiefdoms was foreign to the native orientation, since a supra-barangadic structure never existed in Cebuanan society prior to Spanish colonization. Hence, the new order triggered conflict among Cebuano chiefs, where collectivism was the original norm. When Spanish colonial education began, the Cebuano lost their esteem and became subordinated to the men. Their previous works and position in society were regarded as works of the demon, and the new religious orientation transformed their roles as secondary to the men, to the friars. Consequently, the friars took over the place previously occupied by the Babaylanes. Augustinian missionaries immediately founded a school for boys, Escuela del Nombre de Jesus, after Legazpi established a Spanish enclave in the island of Cebu, and the Colegio de San Ildefonso, founded by the Jesuits in 1595, and were known to be the first educational institutions in the history of Spanish administration in the Philippines. There were still other religious institutions that followed, like parochial schools, conventual schools, the beaterios, seminarios, girls' secondary schools known as the Escuela Superior. In Spanish education, the parish school system molded a submissive populace via corporal punishments and memorized prayers. Rote memorization and friar obedience were the rudiments of daily instructions in school. The philosophy of education this time was one that served the purpose of colonial exploits, and as a social institution necessary for the legitimation of Hispanization in the islands. So strong was that missionary zeal that emphasized the submission of the natives into a consolidated religio-political educational orientation. After 2 to 3 generations, our women metamorphosed into a purely domestic slave, adopting the Spanish concept of temperance and sacrifice of physical sexual fulfillment as requisite for spiritual formation within a male-dominated faith. The women's cultural formation figured out in one prominent institution that served as a core to the formation of Cebuana during this time, which was the Colegio de la Inmaculada Concepcion, or CIC. Comprehensively from 1860, when it was first inaugurated, until the peak of American occupation, and through current times, women's cultural formation is being served in the courses of urbanity, courtesy, good manners, and etiquette for women, and women's religious formation along with the sacraments, from the regularity of attendance in the Eucharistic celebration, the sacrament of penance, the devotion to the Virgin Santissima, the spiritual readings, attendance in the holy hour or vigil for the Blessed Sacrament, the monthly retreats for women and other annual spiritual exercises became the norm as inscribed in the Manual de las Hijas Inmaculada para uso de los asilos, colegios y escuelas de las hijas de la caridad. The same manual was borrowed and implemented even with the public school system of the Escuelas Primarias del Ambos Sexos of the Spanish Moret Decree in 1863. In the American period, political and popular education was introduced in the norm schools, the common grammar schools, the dame schools, the Latin grammar schools, and the public schools. But it did little to change the order of women's education as only secondary to basic priority during the time. The American Army teachers and the Department of Public Instructions in the Philippines built in part on the foundations of the Spanish public school system, such as compulsory primary instruction in the colonial language, Christian doctrine, reading, writing, arithmetic, practical agriculture, and music. The American system of public school instruction commenced with political education the Municipal Government Act of January 1901, where suffrage is limited to the males at 23 years of age and over, plus the following qualifications: previous service as Kapitan Municipal, Gobernadorcillo, Teniente or Cabeza de Barangay, annual payment of 30 pesos in taxes, the ability to speak, read, and write English or Spanish, or real property ownership to commence at 500 peso value during that time. Thus, it limited the franchise to a small percentage of residents or the same elites who dominated the municipal government during the Spanish rule. Act 74, an education bill, established the Bureau of Public Instruction that provided for a centralized system of public primary schools within 36 divisions, empowerment of a superintendent to hire 1,000 trained American teachers, so we had the Thomasites, and authorized division superintendent to appoint Filipino teachers for the schools within their district. The impact of colonial education and the status of women. Schools barely served as a means of preliminary education. Women's education was limited to domestic science. Education was sectarian with no prescribed processes and direction of courses, no explicit or guaranteed standards, and with hardly trained teachers. The curriculum emphasized the importance of schools as institutions to maintain discipline, stressing on the fundamentals of good deportment, character education, and learning within the framework of colonial governance. The processes of social conditioning were made evident through the provisions of the interior regulation of schools and the courses of studies engineered by the Spanish royal government and the American Bureau of Public Instruction, respectively. What happened to the women's sexuality and consciousness? It was the time when the male ethos considered women as subordinates and weak. They regarded women as created by God only to be assistants to the men, and in times of abundance, the women are only slaves to the men. In times of burden, she can be asked to do anything. She has no voice at home. She can be taken anywhere and could even be sold if her husband wishes it. She is a slave. To the men, having a number of lovers was a status symbol, while it is considered indecent for women to also have many flings. In the masculine ethos, a married woman was likened to a dove that should be faithful to her husband. It was also a standard that wives must not be jealous with a husband, and because jealousy breeds contempt from the men. If he commits infidelity, the woman must be patient to wait for him to feel remorse. She must not go after him or abandon him, because a good wife is expected not to leave her abode without the husband's permission. She should never quarrel with him for the reason that a woman gains nothing when she fights with a man. Thus, the wife should avoid trouble. Whenever the man gets angry, even without reason at all, she must keep quiet. In short, this was a period that says, if a woman loves a man, she must never be unfaithful or cause him anger, and above all, she must adore him like God. Furthermore, in this male-dominated order, it was expected that a good woman watched over her home and did not mind others' lives. As a norm, women work all day taking care of the household, the needs of the spouse and the children. They manage the finances and sidelined in business to augment the small incomes of their husbands. But ironically, their contributions were rendered immaterial. The oft-repeated statement during this period was that women should not be given education, for it is not of much use to them. It does not fit them in their duties and is only a waste of time and money. Some women, however, regarded this notion as a serious mistake, so that those who were fortunate enough made themselves excel in all little that was offered only for individual good in both public and domestic spheres. Using the colonial school program as take-off point, some women struggled to reclaim their position at the public sphere. A classic example of educated women during the time were those who graduated from the Colegio de la Inmaculada Concepcion, the Cebu High School, the Cebu Maternity School, the Southern Island School of Nursing, and the Cebu Normal School. Some became popular and exemplary in roles such as being school teachers, frontline medical workers nursing the sick and the wounded during the war, taking care of the orphans, the aged, handling family enterprises, organizing civic clubs for fellow women, and fighting for the right to suffrage among women, and fighting for freedom from the colonial powers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Sanchez. And the next speaker will be Kyra Canete.
Thank you very much for having me. Let me just set up for a few seconds my PowerPoint to begin. Okay, so I'm focusing more on methodology for my presentation. Right. Before I begin, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners, past and present, of the land on which UNSW stands. Our main campus is on the land of the Eora people. To start, in a critical review of the accomplishments and pitfalls of disaster scholarship in the last 40 years, J.C. Gaylord draws attention to the urgency of advancing different epistemologies that reflect diverse local realities of disaster experiences. He notes that the problems and analyses articulated in dominant disaster studies still tend to privilege Western technical, and I would also like to add androcentric knowledges. In this paper, I take up Gaylord's important assertion of the need to decolonize disaster research and let what I refer to in my broader work as epistemologies of the vulnerable shape future pathways of the discipline. I argue in this paper that feminist methods and perspectives can greatly contribute to the promotion of epistemic diversity in conducting research on disasters. Specifically, I make a case for fotocuento, or storytelling with photographs, a feminist photo-based method which I designed for studying women's experiences of disaster recovery as one such contribution to epistemological and methodological reform. While a wide range of research tools in both quantitative and qualitative studies have been utilized to draw out insights on different facets of disaster experiences and responses, there remains little critical examination on research methods themselves, which especially engage with issues on the processes and politics through which knowledge is constructed. Drawing insights from feminist theory, methods, and practice, I problematize two methodological issues, which can be regarded as starting points for exploring and developing a more grounded, ethical, and politically committed approach to producing knowledge and around disaster from below, and more specifically from the South. So the first is power imbalances in researcher-researched relationships and the continuing dominance of research conducted by Western and often male scholars on disasters occurring in the global South. Second, I problematize the kind of tools or mediums of inquiry that are often applied in disaster studies. Specifically, I ask, what tools might be useful to capture the complexity of human experiences in a disaster beyond word-based and often highly technical instruments commonly employed? What techniques might be able to generate more effectively narratives and stories, as well as the embodied experiences, relationships to place, and emotions that are so central to disaster experiences, yet are often overlooked? These methodological questions have long been central concerns for feminist scholarship, broadly speaking. In this paper, I show how fotocuento, which uses photographs in an interview setting, or what we call photo elicitation, engages with the methodological issues that I have raised. Before proceeding, I would like to provide a context for the study. In November 2013, Tacloban City was a site of devastation and loss when Typhoon Yolanda, internationally known as Haiyan, struck the Philippines. Yolanda was recognized as the most powerful storm to have ever made landfall in history, and as such, it had resulted in widespread destruction across the central islands of the Philippines. Over 6,000 fatalities, more than 1 million homes destroyed, and roughly 4 million people displaced, and around 16 million people affected. Tacloban, a highly urbanized city in the Eastern Visayas region of the Philippines, bore the brunt of the typhoon, which generated storm surges of up to 7.5 meters and destroyed entire settlements along the coastal areas. As part of the efforts to build back better from the disaster, Tacloban City initiated a large-scale resettlement of about 90,000 people, from the so-called coastal danger zones to the northern peripheries of the city. Taking into consideration the importance of intersectionality, I engaged with 42 women from 3 selected disaster resettlement sites in Tacloban in order to understand their experiences and perspectives of rebuilding communities for the better. These women belonged to urban poor communities in informal settlements and were displaced as a result of the storm surges that destroyed their homes. Due to their displacement, they and their families became beneficiaries of housing reconstruction and resettlement projects initiated by the state, international and local NGOs, and the private sector. I would like to just skip this discussion and photo-based methods. However, I would like to emphasize that what sets Photocuento apart is its emphasis on the interconnectedness of stories and the people who produce them in order to counter the persistent silences around political, economic, and ecological issues that form the basis for gendered inequalities, disempowerment, and disadvantage aggravated by the experience of disasters. So this particular characteristic of Photocuento resonates well with decolonial and feminist politics, which promotes knowledge production from the margins as a site of nurturing possibilities for transformation. Photocuento is particularly inspired by the research of Bunster and Cheney on experiences of working women in Lima, Peru. Dubbed as the Talking Pictures interview, Bunster and Cheney's method is broadly comprised of 3 stages. So first, taking photographs of women's daily lives, which I call image generation. Second, involving women through a meeting to select photographs to develop the interview tool, which is a photo album. And third, interviewing women using the tool. So my method has some fundamental differences to Bunster and Cheney's approach, which I cannot elaborate on, but it adopts these stages with some modifications. So the first stage is image generation. I draw attention to 2 important aspects which define this stage: participant briefing and image generation as conversation. Participant briefing is a fundamental activity undertaken at the beginning of the Photocuento process. Here, informed consent is obtained by stating the purpose, the focus, the method, and the ethical considerations of the project in detail, including the basic techniques of photography. While Photocuento is participant-driven in the sense that they are provided digital cameras for them to take home and use for a week, the approach is semi-structured. Participants are provided a set of general questions to guide their decisions regarding what kinds of images to capture. I view the act of image generation in this context as already a space for conversation. Hence, as part of the research design, midweek and end-week check-ins were arranged where I would go to the communities and talk with the women participants individually regarding the photos they had taken. I usually asked, "What do you want to tell me with this photograph?" rather than simply saying, "Tell me about this photograph." This slight difference in framing the question allowed the participants to reflect on their reasons and motivations for taking photographs, instead of just describing what one could see in the images they have captured. This line of questioning tended to provoke detailed and emotion-laden responses grounded on concrete experiences, as seen in this quote in the slide, wherein the participant is talking about feelings of being lonely because of separation. After this, she proceeded to talk about some of the significant changes she and her family had experienced as a result of resettlement, and how she, as a mother and a wife, felt the burden of domestic responsibilities in the context of disaster recovery. She showed me another photograph, which she took of a woman in a queue for fetching water while accompanied by a young child. "I can really relate with this," she said, "because no one else is able to help us with childcare. Mothers like myself bring our children with us wherever we go, in whatever we do." So with just 2 pictures, she was able to tell me various layers of her recovery experiences. On one hand, this conversation revealed intimate experiences of recovery at the scale of the body and emotions, home and community, interwoven with performances of care. But on the other hand, it also foregrounded and brought to question the broader institutional processes that had become the grounds for generating such experiences. Rationalities for building back better and resilience building, resettlement processes, governing relations, and the cultural ascription of care work to women and its consequences in disaster recovery, among others. Hence, facilitating and engaging in meaningful conversation through photographs helped expose the fissures in institutional processes of disaster recovery and thereby open these up to more critical analysis. And these would be recurring themes in the Photo Cuento interviews. Stage 2 is developing the Photo Cuento tool. This stage is marked, or the process through which this is accomplished emphasizes the need to share stories, process commonalities and differences in perspectives and experiences, and nurture a sense of awareness of each other's struggles as a form of solidarity despite the differences. This approach to processing participants' photo stories also served as an important purpose for my study of ensuring that the photographs included in the interview tool would resonate and engage with other women's experiences of disaster and subsequent resettlement. So to sum up this process, first they create individual storyboards, and then they post the storyboards in an exhibit, and then they share their stories. Together, they identify themes and categories, and then according to these categories, they start building the album by contributing the photographs that they have generated. The third stage is the Photo Cuento interviews. This is the third and final stage. Utilizing the tool, I interviewed a total of 30 women who were not involved in the tool development process. As a supplement, researchers using the Photo Cuento method might want to develop a set of guide questions to facilitate discussions around the photographs in the album. So what were the lessons that I've learned from the interviews? So first, it made me realize just how much the issue of power was central to research relationships. Initially, my approach to administering the interview had been to hold the photo album up and ask participants their thoughts and reactions towards specific photos. I quickly realized it was not very effective. I could still feel the communication barrier between myself as a privileged Filipino woman and a so-called international researcher and my study participants. It was only when I started to give the participants the album, allow them to touch it, flip through the pages, and hold it for the entire duration of the interview that they began to be more open. I saw this act as also symbolic of handing over control and letting participants take charge of the conversation. In the first few interviews as well, I found myself correcting participants with what they were seeing in the album. One particular interview jolted me to this realization. I was asking a study participant about the things or people that were enabling recovery. And then she pointed to a photo which depicted a group of women, as you can see here, seated around a table, smiling, and said, "I think sometimes we need to relax, get together and have some drinks with our friends." And automatically, I caught myself saying, "Oh, these women aren't drinking." And she looked at it again and said, "Really? I thought they were having a good time because I think that's important." And it was this response that made me reflect how I was interpreting the photograph for her, and how once again I had tried to exercise my own power in the research process. These were very important points of reflection, which if unrecognized would have undermined the purpose of Photo Cuento. And lastly, as most interviews started with recounting traumatic experiences of the disaster, I was concerned that how this would affect the participants. We should absolutely do no harm. But however, my research shows, participants were appreciative of the opportunity to talk about their experiences as a means of emotional release. However, I must caution that anyone who is using this method must always take into consideration not to re-traumatize participants and put in place services should these be needed. So while I am unable to discuss at length the findings of my study in this paper, what came out from the Photo Cuento process was an incisive look into how Build Back Better was assimilated into the local context of Tacloban City. From women's intimate narratives of recovery, Photo Cuento revealed how attempts to rebuild and govern communities were heavily dependent on the participation and care-based practices of women, but have at the same time exacted costs on women's bodies, their energies, and their time. On the other hand, Photo Cuento also bared the ways in which women were qualifying, appropriating, or defying dominant constructs of resilience building and post-disaster development, which pervade much of current disaster risk management practices. While housing reconstruction and resettlement in post-Yolanda Tacloban was based on a rationale of safety and hazard avoidance, as supported by expert and scientific knowledge, women were telling a different story of what they needed and aspired for in recovery, as shown in this quote, which I cannot read in the interest of brevity. So to conclude, my conclusion. From diverse women's narratives of their experiences of Yolanda and subsequent reconstruction, through Photocuento, I was able to gain insight into qualitatively different realms. Photocuento allows both researcher and study participants to rediscover facets of everyday experiences that often escape the gaze and attention of conventional disaster research, the intimate spaces of a house provided after a disaster, women's invisible care work, and the emotions attached to and generated by place. More importantly, Photocuento promotes collaborative knowledge construction. Having participants take photographs independently takes them on a personal and embodied journey through the research process. They become physically present in a place. They hold the camera, look through the lens, they angle their body, they move with the light and the terrain, and see things from their physical and social stature. This facilitates an active involvement and ownership over what gets produced by the research. As one participant commented, I learned more things about my experience and the experiences of others, while another said after the photo elicitation meeting, we are researchers now. Photocuento, despite its potential for meaningful co-production of knowledge, is not impervious to power relations, as I have shown from my own experience of implementing the method. As with any method, positionality must always come under continuous scrutiny as a practice of reflexivity as espoused by decolonial and feminist methodologies. Working with local partners, understanding the social landscape, learning the local language where possible, actively trying to share power, and operationalizing reflexivity in the actual conduct of research can help minimize these power imbalances, which always already characterizes research relationships. If you want to have more about the paper, it's actually just been published by Disaster, so please do feel free to download, and damo nga salamat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, and Rosa is next.
Hello, hi, good evening and good afternoon. I would like to begin by thanking Caroline for organizing this. And it is a privilege for me to come from philosophy to be part of this conversation. And as part of like disciplinary differences, I'm just gonna limit myself to read my presentation. So I look forward for the questions. To understand coloniality, one needs to engage with contemporary struggles, problems, and sociological context of the colonized and post-colonized societies and people. In this presentation, I will reflect about the neoliberal and neocolonial situation and events that led to the political catastrophe after Hurricane Maria, as well as the summer 2019 protests in Puerto Rico that resulted in the resignation of the previous governor, Ricardo Rosselló. With this presentation, I argue that expanding the conversation of inequalities in the Global South beyond gender, race, and class to include coloniality also requires analyzing how coloniality is inseparable from gender, class, and racial hierarchies. The coloniality of power demands that decolonial intellectuals and activists situate their analysis of inequalities precisely in the imbrication of neocolonialism, racism, sexism, and class, not only in the Global South, but also in the relationship between the Global South and the Global North. In the first section of my presentation, I will draw from Afro-Dominican activists, anti-racist, and decolonial feminists, Yudereski Espinosa Muñoz, the post-colonial transnational feminist Chandra Mohanty, and the Aymaran and Bolivian sociologist, historian, and activist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, to problematize decolonial theory and practice produced in the Global North. In the second section, I will draw from the Puerto Rican decolonial feminist Rocio Zambrana, the Puerto Rican decolonial thinker Nelson Maldonado Torres, and the Puerto Rican sociologist and political philosopher Jose Atiles Osorio to introduce the neocolonial and neoliberal coloniality that continues to create inequalities and expels Puerto Ricans from living in the archipelago. This will lead to the last part of my presentation that reflects about the resistance to the neoliberal and neocolonial conditions of Puerto Rico that emerged from the survivors of Maria and the affirmation of life expressed in the 2019 summer protest. I will conclude by arguing that the case of Puerto Rico forced an analysis of decoloniality with its imbrication of neoliberalism and neocolonial catastrophes and resistance. One element that Yudereski, Espinosa Muñoz, Chandra Mohanty, and Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui have in common is their critical self-reflection about the operation of coloniality in the production of knowledge and practices related to women and communities in the global South. Although Mohanty and Rivera Cusicanqui does not use the term coloniality, their critiques to discursive colonization in the case of Mohanty and intellectual recolonization in the case of Cusicanqui point at similar problems coming from their own social, political, and epistemic positionality. These anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and indigenous thinkers compel us to listen carefully about the critiques if we want to engage in ethical dialogue across different Southern experiences and across North-South relations. The commitment to engage in dialogue with struggles and experiences from the Global South requires a methodology to prevent colonizing the experiences, knowledge, and discourses of the other. In her essays, in her classical text, Under Westernized Feminist Scholarship and Colonial Discourses, Mohanty calls our attention about the problems of discursive colonization, the appropriation and codification of knowledge about women in the Third World. Mohanty calls our attention, remind us the importance of situating feminist discussion in the political, historical, material relationship among women in different locations inside the global circulation of goods, services, and resources, or in other words, global capitalism. Using the language of her classic text, the lives of women in the First and Third World are also linked by the interconnections of their economies. Espinosa Muñoz expands on the unequal relationship among women, not only in relation to global capitalism, but also within the hierarchies of race and coloniality. In her translated essay, Toward a Construction of the History of a Disencounter, The Feminist Reason and the Anti-Racist and Decolonial Agency in Abya Yala, Espinosa Muñoz criticized feminist reason for presupposing the universal category of woman that erases the experience of coloniality and racial classification, which are central for understanding the disempowerment of Afro-descendant and indigenous women in their communities. Although race and class has been incorporated in reflections of women in Latin America, they still rely on some occasions on the framework of the experience of women of color and Black women from the United States. Even though both groups have influenced extensively the activism and feminist thinking of Afro-descendant women in Latin America, as the case of the African Brazilian movement of the 80s, there is still a form of coloniality of knowledge in which local voices that analyze racial problems are ignored in favor of privileging the reflection of voices coming from the United States academia, without negating the value and contribution of reflections about race and colonialism from racialized women in the United States. Espinosa Muñoz draws our attention to the different experiences of subaltern, indigenous, and Black women in Latin America. I quote her, "These problems becomes obvious in a field of research, social decolonial turn, that has condemned the coloniality of knowledge, and yet when it comes to thinking about the relationship between coloniality and gender classification, the intellectuals and researchers of coloniality as well turn to the interpretations developed by voices from Black Chicana feminist scholar in the United States, assuming that they also represent those of subaltern in Latin America and the Caribbean," end of quote. Similarly to Espinosa Muñoz's criticism, but in the opposite direction in the economy of knowledge, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui denounces the extraction of knowledge and experiences from indigenous and subaltern communities in Latin America in the production of post-colonial and decolonial knowledge in the US academia. In Shishinasak Utiwa, a reflection on the practices and discourses of decolonization, Rivera Cusicanqui criticized the intellectual recolonization and depoliticization of knowledge that emerged from social and political struggles of indigenous communities in Latin America. Recolonization in Latin America not only comes from the political class and the state bureaucracy, as Rivera Cusicanqui says, but also from the intellectual class that benefits from, and I quote her, the pyramidal structures of power and symbolic capital, end of quote. The issue arises when ideas, concepts, or discourses from indigenous and subaltern communities are taken out of their historical, social, political context, their meanings in relation to their struggle, to then be recodified and resignified in relation to the production of a new jargon that might not speak to the experiences of those same subjects that are spoken about but not spoken with. As Rivera Cusicanqui clearly states, and I quote her, there can be no discourse of decolonization, no theory of decolonization without a decolonizing practice. The problem of coloniality of knowledge coming from the global south cannot be separated from the coloniality of power, from the unequal relationships among racialized and colonized communities and their exploitation under global capitalism. Coming from Puerto Rico, the problem of the coloniality of power needs to be understood in relation to racism, neocolonialism, patriarchy, and neoliberalism. For the next section, I will contextualize a small part of the entangled coloniality of Puerto Rico seen from the neoliberalization of the neocolonial state in the most recent crisis with debt and the Hurricane Maria. Puerto Rico, a neocolonial territory of the United States, or what is officially called a non-incorporated US territory, has gone through a process of economic, environmental, and governmental neoliberal restructuring in the last decade to pay an illegitimate and unpayable public debt of originally 74 billion of bond debt. Jose Atiles Osorias identifies the intensification of Puerto Rico's fiscal economic crisis in 2014 when the credit agencies of Moody's, Fitch Ratings, Standard & Poor's reduced the credit ratings of Puerto Rico's government and its public corporation to the lowest possible level. Because of its colonial status, Puerto Rico couldn't file bankruptcy under Chapter 9 of the United States Federal Bankruptcy Code. In 2016, the US Congress passed the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management and Economic Stability Act, also known as PROMESA, to restructure the Puerto Rican debt by appointing a Financial Oversight Management Board for Puerto Rico, also known locally as La Junta. La Junta is composed of 7 unelected members appointed by the US Congress under the Obama administration, which have the juridical power of restructuring Puerto Rico finances, approving the government budget, and implementing austerity measures with the main objective of paying the debt. La Junta is not the beginning of the implementation of neoliberal austerity measures, but is rather the intensification of austerity measures by an external colonial administration. Jose Atiles Osorio, in his article, The State of Exception and the Puerto Rican Financial Crisis, explained how the government of Puerto Rico has operated on both external and internal colonial states of exception. The internal state of exception can be seen with the local laws and executive orders that the government of Puerto Rico has enforced in the last decade by implementing emergency policies to manage the economic crisis and cut social benefits. One example of the state of exception policy was the Law 7 of 2009, entitled Special Act to Declare a State of Fiscal Emergency and to Establish a Comprehensive Financial Stabilization Plan to salvage the credit of Puerto Rico, of Luis Fortuño administration, that required budgetary cuts, a series of austerity measures, and the dismissal of public employees. Atiles summarized the aggressive program of austerity measures of Fortuño's administration with the following effects. First, with the dismissal of 20,000 public employees. Second, with the reduction of the budget of the University of Puerto Rico. Third, with the privatization of public services. Fourth, the deregulation of finances. Fifth, the development of a strategy for economic growth called public-private partnerships. Although the government has justified these policies as necessary to save the economy, Attilas observed that in reality, they have increased more the social and economic inequalities in Puerto Rican population, and they have normalized the privatization of public services. As well, they have facilitated more corruption and theft from part of the government. Attilas argues that the financial crisis of Puerto Rico has been used to, and I quote him, radically neoliberalize the colonial state, end of the quote. It is the neocolonial relationship of Puerto Rico with the United States that facilitates the process of neoliberalization of the government and the economy. Rocío Zambrana analyzes the public debt of the archipelago as a colonial debt that operates as a form of neoliberal capture and coloniality in her essay, Colonial Debts. It is the colonial exceptionality that allows the debt to work as a mechanism of coloniality. The coloniality of the debt implies the hierarchy of the neoliberal healthy finances over the livability of women, poor, and racialized communities in Puerto Rico. The neoliberal and neocolonial administration continues to exercise violence to these communities, not only through the state of exception policies, but also with the disaster response after the natural event of the Hurricane Maria. To understand contemporary Puerto Rico neocolonial situation also required an awareness of the effect of Hurricane Maria and its effect in conjunction with the neoliberal and neocolonial response of the local and federal government. For Zambrana, debt, coloniality, and slow death are three concepts necessary to understand, and I quote her, Puerto Rico's current predicament, where economic, political, and environmental catastrophe intersect, end of the quote. The hurricane was preceded not only by a decade of neoliberal austerity measures and financial crisis, but is also structured by the colonial relation of Puerto Rico and the US, the neocolonial management of the local government, and the necropolitical administration of life. Nelson Maldonado Torres describes the aftermath of Hurricane Maria as a catastrophe grounded in the intersection of US colonialism, fiscal crisis with the debt, and contemporary coloniality. I quote Nelson Maldonado Torres, Hurricane Maria is a catastrophe inseparable from the catastrophe of Puerto Rican colonialism, a colonialism that continues in liberal, conservative, neoliberal, and neo-fascist times, and the catastrophe of modernity coloniality, end of the quote. For Rocío Zambrana, the humanitarian crisis of Hurricane Maria demonstrates how the intersection of climate change and coloniality increase the vulnerability to disaster. Quoting the feminist collective of Puerto Rico, Zambrana affirms what Naomi Klein has explained with her concept of disaster capitalism, which is the disaster is not natural, but caused by the socioeconomic conditions that increase vulnerabilities and inequalities. The catastrophe of Hurricane Maria can be seen not only by the disorganized response of the government, but also by the expulsion of Puerto Ricans out of the archipelago and the deaths caused after the hurricane. 1 year after the hurricane, most Puerto Ricans were still recovering from the damages to their houses and lack of access to resources in some part of the island. According to FEMA reports, 166,000 homes were still in process of reconstruction and reparation 1 year after the hurricane. By the same period, 160,000 Puerto Ricans were forced to emigrate and establish themselves in the US mainland. In May of 2019, 2 months before the eruption of the protest, Ricardo Rosselló government confirmed that 30,000 homes were still under blue tarp. However, one of the deepest wounds after the hurricane were the social political disaster that took away 4,645 lives. It is from this necropolitical condition that I want to establish the link between survival and resistance between social political catastrophe of Hurricane Maria and the summer protests of 2019.
Rosa, one more minute, please.
Okay. From July 13 to July 24 of 2019, Puerto Ricans took the street to demand the resignation of Governor Ricardo Rosselló after the publication of Telegram chats with homophobic, sexist, classist, fat-shaming, and other insulting comments. It is important to stress that the conversation of the chat leaks occurred 1 year after Maria, where Puerto Ricans were still recovering, emigrating, and still mourning the death of relatives and cherished ones. It is important to recognize the complexity of what moves people to take the street. In this reflection, I will only stop briefly at insensitive comments made about the death of Hurricane Maria and the deaths of two known figures of the pro-independence movement. Christian Sobrino, at the time top financial official of the government, he mocked the death of Maria that were accumulated at the Forensic Institute in Puerto Rico. In a conversation leaked about the problem of accumulation of bodies in the Forensic Institute, Sobrino said, "Now that we are on this topic, don't we have another dead body to feed the ravens?" The comment of Sobrino symbolized the general necropolitical attitude of the government that devalued the lives of Puerto Ricans not only through their thought, but through their actions. The lives of Puerto Ricans had not been valued by the neocolonial and neoliberal government, with the lack of organized response after the hurricane, with the mismanagement and corruption with public funds directed to the process of recovery, and with the decades of neoliberal policy that made dignified life difficult in poor and racialized community in Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And the next speaker will be Sujata Patel. Professor Patel, yeah, now you're unmuted, sorry.
Thank you, Caroline. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this this presentation, and I'm trying to share the is it on? Is the screen on?
Yes, it is. It's visible.
Yeah, okay. So let me start by saying that I think the North-South, a perspective on the North-South axis, and whichever way one discusses it as being decolonial or post-colonial, or an assessment of indigenous, has raised a lot of issues which we need to discuss. But I would also like to suggest that it has raised, at least at this point, it has allowed us to also think of the limitations of what this is and what it can tell us in terms of doing sociology. And in order to understand this, I would like to discuss studies on caste, which has taken new turns in the course of last 70 years. And given the long history and the dense discussions that have taken place, I'm trying to put it in very brief way in this set of slides. And I do hope I make myself clear when I do this, because the discussions are very complex and very and relate to the diversity and plurality of the structuring of caste historically. Let me start with what the North-South critique has presented us about caste studies that have taken place for the last 200 years. I use the term post-colonial to represent this critique because this is how they present themselves. It's really a critique based by a group of scholars in North America, and very interestingly, it has been associated particularly with the South Asian program in Chicago. And they have argued very, very sharply and succinctly that the caste system is an Orientalist construction rooted in colonial racist perspectives of administrators and anthropologists of 19th century who projected caste as being, quote, a religious representation of hierarchy, that is a Hindu and now a South Asian system, and is unique to India. That is, there is no such system all across the world, or you cannot find caste in other parts of the world. It is associated with the work of Bernard Cohn, who started discussing this issue in late 60s. And then it went into a discussion with other anthropologists, and one of them is Ronald Inden, who suggested that this construction of caste is related to an assessment of it being the other of the rational, scientific, modern, democratic Western world. And it is associated also with the idea, so the critique suggests that the British used the Portuguese-Spanish word of castas, which meant race, lineage, and breed, to substitute the Indian word called varna. In Sanskrit, it means color, and used its fourfold system to suggest that caste was a ranked order particular to India. This model presented caste as a singular, uniform, and a stable system of India, and they argue, the post-colonialists, that is why caste and race are intertwined to each other, because it is through the prism of race that caste was perceived as continuing racial hierarchies, but in a significantly different way given the Varna model in India. And in that context, Nicholas Dirks, again from Chicago, has suggested that in the colonial period, various state actors, such as the British Orientalists, the administrators, the missionaries, Indian reformers, social thinkers, and political actors constituted the caste system as a uniform, all-encompassing, ideologically consistent system, and as a principal modality of Indian society, the most important emblem of tradition. As a consequence, various scholars would like to argue that caste has overtaken other forms of stratification that is there in the country, and it has led their critique has been based on the fact that this has led various sociologists and social anthropologists to suggest that caste is an overwhelming arena of division and hierarchy in the country. And therefore, one has to see caste as, because in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, caste was seen as a way to think about hierarchies. Therefore, this is related to way the British understood its implication in constituting stratification in the region of in India and in the South Asian, therefore by extension in South Asia. So our understanding of the post-colonial critique has expanded our understanding of caste in a number of ways. It has shown the constructed nature of caste and the role of political institutions, that is colonialism, in defining caste and social relationships. It has allowed for dismantling the essentialist view of caste as a core pan-Indian religious institution, revealing the perplexing multiplicity of various identities that were at play in the pre-colonial period, and demonstrates that caste as a core institution of Indian society has come into fruition only during colonial period. It has also shown the role of politics, power relations in the discourse, and today caste tends to mark or accommodate other social. It has allowed for us to think of how caste tends to mark or accommodate other social identifications, which will become evident in the following discussion of caste relation to the political, class, cultural, and ethnic identities. However, there's another position that has evolved since the post-colonial critique has presented this critique of caste. And this critique is called the subaltern critique. It draws, interestingly, it is again connected to the North-South in a different way. It draws from the history of race protests in the USA in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and it calls itself a Dalit, an oppressed critique, and highlights not only the increase of practices of untouchability and humiliation, but also the increase of caste discrimination and social exclusions. In this version, caste is a Brahmanic system of domination, an analysis which has similarities with a post-colonial approach, which also suggested that it was a Brahmanic understanding of caste which was institutionalized in the colonial period. And members of this group would like to argue that caste and race have same features. And they attended the World Congress of Racism in 2001 when it took place in Durban, and argued that the two are similar. This interrogation of the colonial making of the caste allowed this interrogation of the colonial making of the caste system and the position of the subaltern groups, which argued that caste and race were related to each other, has allowed for its universalization as an abstract model across the world. And now it is being discussed not only in terms of how caste has been exported in the Indian diaspora, but to comprehend the discrimination in Japan against the Buraku, or in Nigeria against the Osu, or in Senegal, or in the Americas, from where the term caste actually comes. Ironically, if race has fueled the study of caste in 19th century, in turn, caste discourse has fueled the study of race. Just recently, a month back, a new book has come out, Understanding Race, Caste, and its title, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. But does this mean that we have a South perspective that has evolved to become a global perspective on caste? Do we really have a global theory on caste? Has the colonial episteme been displaced? In order to answer this question, let me go back to the studies of caste in India. And I would like to suggest that both the post-colonial critique and the subaltern critique that suggests that caste and race intertwine have not found traction among social scientists in India who use the methodological nationalist perspective. They continue to work on a different model wherein caste is defined as jatis, that is, endogamous groups having common occupations, and their assessments today relate to labor, exploitation, and gender, rather than thinking of caste as a colonial construction. And why do they do so? Since the 90s, academic discourses have argued that caste. So there have been 3 or 4 arguments put forward. The first being that caste has adjusted to both the colonial state and post-independent state, using state policy and classifications to fuel upward mobilities, leading subcaste groups to merge with each other and become ethnic groups in order to use demographics to consolidate political power within parties and within regimes. So caste has been used as an identity formation to grasp and take over power and allow for its redistribution. And this is an argument which many political sociologists have presented since the 1980s and have suggested that this has led to further democratization of the political regime. Secondly, historians have engaged with the post-colonial positions and have almost dismissed by arguing that caste hierarchy and anti-caste social religious movements have evolved very early in India. Though since the 12th century, there was a consolidation of hierarchical authority supported by regime consolidation and the formation of early modernity in the country. Thus, it is not colonialism that constituted caste through its discourse and state interventions. Rather, there were different forms of Brahminic domination, and even Buddhism and Jainism, which were anti-caste movements, had also evolved different ways of caste domination. So there has been a long tradition, much longer than colonialism, of caste hierarchy being constituted in different ways within the country. Historians have also followed sociologists to assert that there were regional variations and that caste distinctions have not conformed to any singular model. Both groups of scholars assert today that customs and practices of jati hierarchies vary from region to region, and that even within one village, its population may commonly interpret caste in different ways. Diversity and variation needs to be comprehended. It is in this context I would like to conclude this presentation by asking, what are the challenges in doing sociology in different geographies? And I ask this question very consciously because, as I said earlier, caste is now seen as a way to understand hierarchy hierarchy and institutionalized hierarchy within Japan, within Nigeria, within Senegal, within the Americas, and now even used in understanding race in United States. The question is, has the post-colonial critique helped? And I ask this question because it has become unclear now as to what are the attributes of caste today, which we can analyze and see it as a distinctive way of constituting hierarchy as against other ways of constituting hierarchy. So the post-colonial critique has highlighted the limitations of the methodological nationalist perspective of the 50s and the 60s. But it has not allowed for an empirical investigation. It has not promoted an empirical investigation, which is what sociology does, in various geographies where you have today both ways in which class exploitation, caste discrimination, and cultural exclusion are organized in context to formal and informal domination.
One more minute, please, Sugata.
So one needs to do caste, class, gender intersections in contemporary geographies to do to have a best practice of doing social science. And I end by suggesting that if the North-South critique has opened up discussions, it has also indicated that sociology, which is oriented to doing empirical work, needs to engage with the methodological nationalist interventions as vividly as it has with the post-colonial. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sujata. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat or raise your hand. And the formal session will end in about 3 to 4 minutes, but we will informally stay behind for another 20 minutes or so. So just feel free to leave at any time, and yeah, no pressure. And the first question we got is, thanks to all the panelists, I'm a grad student in the US and I'd like to know how I can respectfully engage with indigenous Philippine values like Kapwa, recognizing the self in the other in my research on queer Filipinas in the US. So would any of the Philippine presenters maybe want to discuss this?
Yes. I would suggest that Veronica get in touch with the organization Babaylan in the University of the Philippines. The Babaylans are gay Filipinos, and she's interested with queer. There are also queer in parts of the Babaylan, and also the Rainbow Group, or the I forgot the name. There's the Pride Group in UP, and there are also Pride groups all over the islands where she can integrate with if she has time.
Maybe for me as well, since I've been discussing a methodology, and I think that's a very important question to ask. For me, there is really no method or no model for, interpretation and representation that will really take us out of these ethical dilemmas of power imbalances. But I think it's a very good start that you recognize your own positionality and the power that you hold that is intrinsic to that researcher and researched relationship. And this is what I tried to do, that as much as possible, although I know it's not totally possible to be able to say like, okay, this is your interpretation and then this is fully the knowledge, because from the very beginning, when you start to identify your research questions, when you start to create your design, you are already interpreting, right? And so I think here, what's very important is a reflexive awareness of our multiple positions and identities. And the openness to really engage with our participants and see them not as a source of information, but as partners in this research. I'm still in this dilemma, actually, in a sense that, okay, I am still going to be the author of everything that I produce out of this knowledge, and that is a dilemma that I will probably not be able to fully resolve. But as Donna Haraway would tell us, stay with the troubles. And I think that is an entry point to a more fruitful and socially relevant scholarship.
Okay, thank you so much. There's another question for you. Were you able to reconnect with your research participants after the initial study? The person is curious about using this research method over time. And after that, Jacob, please ask your question over microphone.
Yes. For me? Was that for me? Okay.
Yeah, for you, Karen.
Yes, I was actually been there for three periods, 3 stages of my fieldwork. So in 2017, 2018, and 2019. I did not include in my discussion how I also returned the results of the research, which I did community exhibits of the photographs and the stories that were being told, and allowed them to add to the stories and really engage with them. There was one suggestion that really got to me. With one participant said, I wish that people in power could see this, because that is a way for us to be able to initiate change in our experiences here at resettlement. And we were planning to do that, but COVID-19 happened and we're like stuck where we are. But I really am hoping to make this a continuous engagement in the future, hopefully near future.
Jacob, please.
Okay. Yes. So I was wondering, the question is for Jata Patel. You mentioned, you seem to suggest that there's lots of these varieties of caste system, and some of them are very localized and provincial. And so I'm wondering if you think that since a lot of international migration and internal migration is driven by these kind of meritocratic criteria, like formal education and skill attainment and building, if that may be a way to undermine the caste systems, this kind of movement of people between locales. And I think, I read it a long time ago, but I think Suzanne and Lloyd, Rudolph Lloyd at University of Chicago, actually their proper name is, Lloyd Irving Rudolph and Suzanne Over Rudolph. I think they had a study of that related to this, Dalits in southern India, where they moved to like different parts of India where like people didn't see them as disenfranchised. And so I'm wondering if that might open possible alternative futures for like undermining caste systems. And I'd like to think it could happen too with our own racialized caste system in the US. But I also know from my work in China that because of colonialism, a lot of other societies like Asian societies have also absorbed our own like globalized kind of racial caste systems. It's like black people at the bottom and white people at the top due to kind of globalization. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. You're muted.
Sujata, you're still muted.
I'm okay now?
Yes, now it's good.
Yeah. There is a difficulty to suggest that only expansion of economic forces, in migration, etc., will help to break down the system. There are two positions that we have today in caste studies. One which suggests that modern democracy and modern secular forces has intervened to break existing discrimination. And we have another position that in fact it has increased discrimination. And why has it done so? It has done so because when migration takes place among families and then kin groups who carry these cultural baggages with each other. And that's why we've had recently, in the case in California of caste discrimination, court case emerging where those who have been part of a professional organization have complained that their promotion has not been accepted by the organization because it was headed by an upper caste Indian. So we have both these positions, and sociologists have constantly engaged with both these positions. And today, at least within India, we see sociologists, therefore, looking at the way the intersection of class, caste, and gender has organized domination. Because as long as we have economic inequalities all across the world and within different geographies, we will see different ways in which received ideologies such as casteism is used to justify and legitimize discrimination.
Okay, thank you so much. And we have a new question for all of the panelists. All of you touched upon methodological nationalism in some way and global North's dominance over global South in the politics of knowledge production. Do any of you have thoughts on how to deal with or dismantle these systems structurally and methodologically, especially keeping in mind the political economy within which these processes operate? And I also want to say, I want to open the floor for general comments and questions about decolonization or destratification of global knowledge production. So of course you can still ask questions about the individual presentations, or you can also make general questions or comments. Okay, anyone wants to answer the question?
I'd like to start.
Can I say something? Caroline, how do you want to organize it? Do you want it linearly in terms of the presenters?
Anyone, yeah, please. Please, you go ahead, and then Phoebe, maybe.
Okay, so I would like to suggest that it is very important to understand the geographies that have been constructed in the global geopolitics that we are in. And these geographies need to be sociologically examined, because within these geographies there are so the global economy, political economy, is organized in terms of the uneven geographies that have been constituted, and sociologists have to engage to try and understand how social inequalities are constructed and constituted in these geographies. So I'm deliberately using the term geographies rather than nation state and nation, because it is not necessary that territory is equal to nation. These geographies may be territorially organized differentially within the whole global world and not equated to the nation. This implies that each of our social science knowledge structures, which are organized in terms of nation state, needs to engage with ways to think about these geographies. And this includes not only those who control the production of knowledge and circulated it, but also the circulation of knowledge within nation states which did not recognize these geographies. Now, the problem is, what are these geographies? They are not necessarily only that which has been organized by political economy, but these are also those which are ecologically and culturally distinct. And this is a very big challenge, because this is like an amoeba formation, where the territory is not stable. And that is why it has a methodological problem, because all our methodologies are related to territorialization of doing research. Village, district, nation state, etc. And how do we do research which is related to territories which are constantly changing their geographies? And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenge, at least I personally am facing to try and do research which is sociological. Thank you.
I
So
would
I
say,
want to add something to, Phoebe, go ahead and then I'll add something.
sorry.
No,
Okay.
go ahead, you go on first.
I would say that the political economy of gender relations is a byproduct of the internationalization of the division of labor. And it is so difficult to speak of decolonization if we don't touch this aspect. Like, for example, the more specific thing that's happening now is that we don't even have data established between derogation of human rights and the implementation of structural adjustments program. For instance, the deregulation of markets, the liberalization of markets, or privatization, where public corporations are being privatized or public subsidies are taken out. These are actually attacking women, and particularly the households. And who are in the households? Who are the ones who are involved directly with the production in the households? The domestic labor, which is not accounted as GDP, has been attacking us, you know, and a lot of women are into international labor now, like using the colonial constructs that we achieved because of our education from the past. A lot of women are now working abroad and still repeatedly doing women's labor. For example, caregiving. A lot of Filipinos are out. And in fact, the Filipino workers have a distinct name, overseas Filipino workers, OFW, because we have a lot of these internationalized labor, okay? So when we speak of decolonizing, the first thing we should do is deconstruct this structural adjustments program first. The problem with the structural adjustments program is that this is being imposed to governments in the third world because of debts. Now with the pandemic, the debts are bloated, and all the more, after we return to normal, the next thing is what could be the ramification of the gender relations, of the political economy of gender relations, and the internationalization of the division of labor and the impact to the communities. People will be selling their labor abroad because they have to get dollars, and the dollars will pay back. But governments are taking away public subsidies. Governments are implementing a freezing of wages at home. So the only way is to get out of the country and look for a job abroad.
Okay, I will go then. All I wish to add to those two
Migration.
explanations, it's not even so much migration. I'm just going to, because I agree with what you just said, I'm going to address the third part, I think, of the doctor's question, or the way I understood it, that you have thoughts on how to deal with dismantling these systems. Since I was actually talking about kind of academic production and dissemination, and this is something I've been thinking about for a long time with some of the scholars on this panel. One of the things that's always really striking to me, or has been, is the ways in which in different countries across the world, academics are being held to, you have to publish in all of these international journals in other countries. Those are social movements for those countries to challenge and really cut at the heart of it. And why I'm saying that these are part of social movements in those countries is because it's actually erasing valuable knowledge that exists because of a new hierarchy that's coming in with which are these institutions that have the networks to be able to publish somewhere else. So on the one hand, you of course need to have a lot of people, including yourselves, really questioning why and how we are engaging with certain theories, whether we are co-opting, whether we are overriding. And Sujata Patel's presentation did a wonderful job of how you come up with explanations which might not actually work that well on the ground, located somewhere else. So those things definitely have to happen. But I think there also have to be challenges on the ground as to why so many countries are beginning to look for these so-called international standards. I mean, I'm always reviewing grants and people's promotions and so on around the world, and it's becoming fascinating to me how much more of northern knowledge structures are being used to justify the worth of people's work, and there's no need for that. So that was just addressing the last part. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you so much. And
if I may go.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Yes, if I may go to add a last point, and I agree with all the comments. I think also the question of decolonization and how that affects our methodologies really depend on the subject of the study and the geography or the specific context that we're studying. Because, looking at the problems of how, we still have some form of colonization or neocolonialism in Puerto Rico is very different from the ways that we try to understand settler colonialism in the United States, or the ways that colonialism works in Latin America. And I think one important part is to really understand or question ourselves about the motivations and why we're doing the kind of work that we are committed to, and what are the effects that work might contribute to a specific form of to a specific community that is in struggle. So for me, when I think about the case of Puerto Rico, I always think first that I need to be connected with the situation of Puerto Rico. I need to be connected to organization. I need to be connected with some social movement, or I need to have a form of personal relation, because I think one problem in some research that are proposing a form of decolonization is that decolonization just stay at the level of epistemic decolonization, but there's no form of political or personal commitment to that project. And I think I agree with some of the previous comments that it's very important to also begin from the very material conditions of the place that we're analyzing, because I cannot talk about decolonizing epistemically Puerto Rico if I don't address the problem of colonialism and how colonialism also affects our economy, and how that also have increased the knowledgeization of the state. So I think that it is important to have those epistemic questions, but we also need to really look at the socioeconomic conditions of the specific context and try to have a form of connection with the struggle. Because I think one important thing is that people are always resisting this form of like neoliberal policies or neocolonial governments. And I think it's important to have a form of connection and speak with the people that are already in those struggles.
Caroline? Is it okay if I just
please.
Yeah. So I think I take the question as in two parts. So one is about this project of decolonialism. And on the other hand, I also take it as a question for us as scholars and academics in terms of how we position ourselves within that broader project, right? And I'd like to address that second question because I believe like everyone else has like really exceptionally elaborated on the first one. So for me, I always look at my own position. I'm a global South scholar, but at the same time, I'm very privileged, right? And the question really is, how uncomfortable are we prepared to be to align ourselves with such a particular project? And how do we learn to use the tools of that privilege in order to contribute to this whole, as you said, dismantling and really disrupting this entire system? And I think there are so many ways to do it. And I really like the idea of solidarities that are actually based on the rhythms and flows of everyday life of people who struggle with all these kinds of issues and disempowerment and oppression on a daily basis, and to try to really recenter these kinds of lived experiences. These are not to romanticize these experiences, but to show that there are diverse ways of seeing the world and of being in the world. And I think as personally, I cannot dismantle everything, but I'm definitely going to do my very best in whatever limited capacity I have to be part of that project.
If there are no more responses, we have a next question, which is from Fiji, and reads, are companies engaged in the research and application of what has been dubbed the Fiji happiness theory? Much of this is anchored in indigenous values of Fiji and Pacific Islanders in general, and they're just started online sessions and are very interested in using Kyra's methodology. And they're asking, how do you adapt this maybe to online sessions?
No. The photography or
Cannot be done.
Fiji happiness theory about
Yeah.
anchored in indigenous values of Fiji and
Mhm.
Pacific Islanders in general.
Mhm. And to use the photo quantum method, is that the question?
Yeah, online.
Yeah.
How to use it maybe
Mhm.
online, if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, well, that would be
Visualizes.
challenging. That would be challenging because the method requires, spending time really to take images and think about what are the spaces, objects, relationships that you can capture on camera. But maybe because it's a drawn out project, so it's not something that you can do in like one sitting. So as I've said, it's about photography, but it's also about engagement. And if there is a way to sort of factor that in, maybe as a longer term project rather than just a one-off sit down. So, well, it's certainly something we can think about.
Okay, and Jacob asks, it's interesting to think whether Amartya Sen or Rabita Tagore would have contributed so much to our knowledge and or won their Nobel Prizes if they were unable to go abroad and had to publish in international journals, quote unquote, or affiliate with institutes in the global north. I suppose there are many other potential lost Miltons we can think of due to these international regimes of knowledge power.
That was just a comment following on what Vandana was talking.
Any comments on that, or should I go to the next question?
Actually, I kind of wrote an answer to that, and that was a conversation with Jacob. I think we can skip that and move
Okay.
right along.
Yeah,
Okay.
this is counterfactual.
Okay.
Yeah, I can talk with you at length on that separately.
And Marivir has two questions. Would you want to switch on your microphone and ask it yourself?
Marivir.
Hi, I have a question for Bandana.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm based here in the US for more than 10 years now, 13 years. And we see that, I see your point that the issue here is for immigrants to feel, to be assimilated in the main society of US. And there's the big conflict because there's an economic consideration to that, as well as racial. And so how do you propose to make women's movement, women of color movement effective in the US so that the voices are not in the fringes? Thank you.
Thank you for both of those questions, actually. When I was talking about assimilation and integration, I was talking about where the dominant scholarship is located. Actually, what has happened, if we look at the history of immigrants in the US, and that includes a lot of struggles, a lot of social movements, including constantly by women's groups organizing for labor rights, for rights of citizenships, all kinds of rights. I mean, this is the piece that I really research on and I study. So I think you and I are talking about the same thing. That is, on the one hand, the dominant focus of migration studies might be on assimilation and integration, but realistically, if one wants to understand how immigrants who are deemed non-white fit into the US, it has always been and it continues to be through struggles that claim human rights. Whether people are using the term human right or not is quite beside the point, but the struggles that demand the right to fair wages, the right to non-segregated housing, the right to access education, the right to healthcare, every one of these have been struggles. And along with that, I should say the political right against excessive state violence and surveillance. If you take the case from Japanese American internments to the extra surveillance of a lot of immigrants, but particularly people who are Muslims and who are Sikhs, you just have these absolute streams of movements and claims. And realistically, to understand integration, in my opinion, as a substantive human rights scholar, one has to see when these movements succeed, under what conditions, and when they don't. And that's about the only way in understanding which groups are able to get a whole access to the tapestry of political and social and economic and cultural rights in this country. Because if you're not able to understand that, just merely understanding whether people learned English or whether they learned higher education means nothing. I've done work as far back as early 2000s, maybe published in 2003 or 4, on the children of South Asian immigrants, and a particular group that came highly educated, that was already in white-collar occupations and all the rest of it, to try and understand how racism affects their children. Mm-hmm. And then what their children do about it, sometimes with the support of their parents, to try and address some of these racial challenges. So it is always about challenging those boundaries. It's always about challenging those powers. And sometimes groups succeed and at times they don't. And that really is the story of migration, in my opinion.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for this.
Question.
And we should come to an end, otherwise it just gets super long. But would all of the panelists want to say some concluding remarks or insights?
Okay. I'll just say thank you. This was great. And thank you, Caroline, for pushing me to be one of the panelists. I had just said I'd be a moderator first, but she convinced me otherwise. So I got to hear this feast, really a banquet of all of your presentations and ideas, and the questions people raise. So I just want to say thank you.
Same here, Caroline. Thank you so much. It has been difficult for me to accept all the issues that we had in our conversations about getting me involved in this panel, but I'm so glad I participated. Thank you so much. And it was wonderful meeting all the colleagues in the panel and to understand their work. So I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you so much as well. It's been a privilege to be with you.
Thank you. I really learned a lot from everyone. I respect all the panelists.
Okay, thank you so much, and everyone. And did everyone get to say something, or did I miss someone? Dr. Sanchez, did you guys get to say something?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I just want to thank you. We appreciate all the questions that also contribute a lot. And of course, the emphasis on the boundaries. I would still go on the aspect of looking into the problem with the structural adjustments program that has caused the internationalization of the division of labor and this worsening problem of the political economy of gender relations in the global scale.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I just want to invite everyone to our Facebook group again, which is kind of not everyone, all the panelists' Facebook group, but we are thinking there's also a decolonial reading group Singapore and other groups, and we are thinking of doing another event like this, maybe completely unattached to a established conference, to just connect decolonial and Southern scholars in different regions who might not be able to travel, because also a big problem is that conferences and flights are so expensive that a lot of works have been kind of isolated, except for the most senior scholars. So yeah, please take a look at the group, and we will try to put something together and then update everyone. Okay, thank you so much for this, and yeah, we're closing.
Thank you. And from me, good night. I know it's morning for several of you.